Welcome back to another episode of Musa Theories. Today's episode is a bit different one because Musa Theories is more of a historical, philosophical. But today I'll do something a little bit different. It's the only one I'll do different. So this episode is inspired from my lecture at George Brown campus here in Toronto. It was a podcamp. This was the 17th annual conference at George Brown University. So my main topic was how to stimulate meaningful conversations. So today I'd like to also thank PodCamp Toronto for inviting me to be one of the speakers at the event. Thank you so much. So today, for those who missed, make sure you don't miss my next events because I won't be doing this like giving you guys all the lectures I do in events. It's only this. This one is a special one. So today I'm going to teach you how to have meaningful conversations. So we'll start. The first thing of having a meaningful conversation is listen more, speak less. Why do I say this? While growing up, I come from a very big family. I have 8 sisters and I'm the youngest. So while growing up, I used to have so many fights with my sisters who are way older than me. And these arguments and fights never really used to make any sense. So one time, my mom calls me. May her soul rest in peace. My mom calls me. She tells me, Moses, what's going on? You're always fighting with your sisters. What's the problem? I'm like, I'm talking to them. They're not listening to me. So my mother told me, you know what? Let's try the other way around. Speak less and start listening to them more. So I decided, you know what? I'll start listening more to them than me always trying to make them listen to me. In the process of me trying to listen to them, I understood what really their concerns were. I started to understand like some of the problems were really easy fixes because I was listening. When you listen, you catch a few things that you haven't really grasped. You start knowing what people really want from you. I'm not saying you should do what people expect from you. I'm saying like you start to understand how some people's actions are related to how you have a conversation with them. And by saying that, I'm not saying that always you should be the one listening. You should also try to play both sides. There are at points where in a room whereby you need to listen more. And there's some points in a room whereby you're the one who is speaking more. The point here is know when you're supposed to listen, know when you're supposed to speak. But one thing you should always put in mind is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So, of course, listening takes the order of the day. Because for you to listen, that's when you can ask meaningful questions. Bringing me to the next point, which is asking meaningful questions. And when I say asking meaningful questions, I will give you 2 kinds of questions. The first question is a positive question, then there is a negative question. Let me start with a negative question, which are also known as gaslighting questions. I'm sure you have met people in your lives whereby they tell you some of their perspectives or how they see life, and you're like, are you crazy? Are you crazy is an example of a gaslighting questions. When you ask someone, are you crazy? That puts them in a defensive mode. Someone starts thinking like, wait a minute. Are my ways of life wrong? Like, why is this person saying me crazy? This is just how I live. For example, when you ask crazy, it really just leaves a bad taste in someone. But to change this, you're supposed to ask positive questions or meaningful questions. When you feel like someone is saying something that deserves you to ask, are you crazy? Don't say that. what I am advising you, but I also I'm also a victim. Sometimes I say, are you crazy? What you're supposed to ask is, why do you think that is? Try to figure out why someone thinks that way. Like, try to understand their message. Because having lived in Canada, you start to understand we all come from different backgrounds. Like, people understand things differently. Look at it like food. There's different kinds of food, but we all enjoy it. Like, understand the spices of this are not the same spices of a kind of food. When you're eating Jamaican food like jack chicken, it has different spices when you're eating Greek food, like which has souvlaki or something of the sort. The way it has been cooked is different, but we all enjoy the chicken. Look at it in a conversational manner. Look at it that way. When people are having conversation, me and you, we come from different backgrounds. We see things different and different at all. So when you're asking meaningful questions, avoid that part whereby you're saying, are you crazy? It doesn't work that way. You're supposed to try and understand what the other person is trying to portray. My second point is understand the complexity of issues. There's some issues or some conversations whereby we cannot all agree. Some issues are very complex. When you look at the world today, there are conflicts all over the place. Some conflicts are religious based, some conflicts are tribal based, some conflicts are territorial based. So when you see these kind of issues, you are supposed to listen to all perspectives. When people are fighting or having an argument over religion, understand where they're coming from. When people are fighting over tribal issues, understand why people are having that kind of argument. When you look at, let's say, when you're having a debate and you come from a different set of background, how I will debate and how you will debate, it will be very different depending on our perspectives, how we see life. Like some matters, it's all our conversations are literally controlled by perspectives, like total perspectives. Look at it this way. When you are driving, probably in Canada, they look at the driving here is different when you go to other countries. First of all, here when you're driving, it's mostly left-hand drive. When you go to some other countries, it's right-hand drive. It's still driving, but you cannot blame someone else. So when you're having a conversation or a meaningful conversation, you're supposed to understand the perspective. Why are these guys driving on the right? Why are these guys driving on the left? The third thing while having a meaningful conversation is also you have to understand who you're having a conversation with. I keep on stressing, there are some conversations you really don't need to have them. Not all conversations are meaningful, and not all conversations are you're not supposed to have all conversations. You have to choose who you're having a meaningful conversation with. When you see the conversation is not going to go anywhere, or there's going to be a conflict arising, I would advise, do not have the conversation. Leave it. It's not a must to have the conversation. Having a meaningful conversation has to be the person you're having a conversation with is willing to listen to you and understand you, and vice versa. You are supposed to understand the person, and the person is supposed to understand you. That's how you are having a meaningful conversation. The other thing about having a meaningful conversation is sometimes you need to do research before having certain conversations. I cannot come here and start telling you about rocket science, which I have literally zero like zero knowledge and background about rocket science. Having meaningful conversations sometimes needs you to have that research background. You need to have knowledge. It's like you going to school, you expect your teacher to know what they're teaching you. So when I'm having a conversation with someone, I am expecting someone to know what they're talking about. And when I'm telling someone about something, I am even expecting from myself that I am that I know what I'm talking about. It's not that things I am just pulling off my brain. Another thing about having meaningful conversations is you are supposed to add value to conversations. The other day, I was listening to a conversation between two teenagers. They were talking about the pyramids of Egypt. One of them knew just the pyramids, like, yeah, the Giza pyramids. The other one knew the names of all the three pyramids. I'm sure most of you don't know the pyramids are in Egypt, yes, but you don't know the name of the pyramids. So the three pyramids are Khufu, uh, Mankuru. I don't know how to pronounce the other one. It's something starts with an MENK something. It's a bit complicated for my because of my mother tongue strength. I cannot pronounce it very well. Then the other one is Khafre, and they are all the pyramids are in the Giza plateau. One thing also the other teenager added was most pyramids are not even in Egypt. The big ones, yes, the Giza pyramids, they're big ones, but most of the pyramids are down south in Sudan. So that's how you start adding value to a conversation. Because the one teenager knew about the pyramids, but didn't know everything about the pyramids. The other teenager knew more about the pyramids. So he was able to add value to the conversation because now this other teenager knew more about the pyramids. Another point of having a meaningful conversation is being present, being there. This is basically relates to the point of just listening to the person you're having a conversation with. But also as human being, we also understand there are challenges. Probably that day you had a very rough day. Probably you missed the bus. Maybe your car had issues to begin with. There was a problem, like you just had a bad day. So when you're having a conversation, you're thinking of all the issues. So at this point, I will advise something called how to stimulate your brain for you to be present. Because there are some conversations, probably it's very important. Maybe this conversation can lead to you being promoted to a new job. Maybe this conversation can lead to your next big sale. You cannot allow the traumas of life control other aspects of life because things happen. We all go through troubles. I don't think there's anyone right now who's watching me, his life is perfect. If there's anyone out there watching me right now that your life is perfect and everything is going on as planned, please advise me. I would like to know how that happens. So, in trying to stimulate the brain, I usually say, do that one thing that even if I wake you up in the middle of the night, you will do it. For example, for me, like if you watched some of my Instagram stories about when I was presenting how to have meaningful conversations, I demonstrated by doing push-ups. In that way, your brain is stimulated and your concentration levels, if they were at 30%, they are no longer at 30%. They will go somehow higher. They will be way higher than you. You will be listening more. You will be adding more value. You will be participating because conversation is a two-way street. There's someone communicating, there's someone listening. And since you have stimulated your brain, you are now present in that moment and you are listening or you are having a meaningful conversation. The other thing about having a meaningful conversation is self and awareness, is understanding yourself. Who are you? Have you ever asked yourself, like, who are you? Like, who are you in that conversation? Am I the listener, or am I the one giving out the information? Understand yourself, understand your weaknesses, understand your strengths. When I say this, there's some conversation which may lead to you being triggered. There's some conversations which are really, really hard out here. So understand your level of tolerance so that you also understand, do I really need to be in this kind of conversation? Because if you don't understand yourself and then you end up having a conversation with someone which triggers you or which brings up probably certain traumas in your life, I would advise first look inward. Know thyself. That's very important. Know who you are. Know what you stand for. Like I said, they're not all conversations we need to have them. Because some conversations can really either offend you or offend the other person. Because as you know yourself, you will be able to either engage or disengage in certain kinds of conversations. If you know you don't stand towards a certain principle, you can be like, hey, I'm not comfortable talking about this at this moment. We can talk about it probably later. Or avoid the whole conversation totally. Like, you really, really don't need to have the conversation because you understand yourself. Another thing about having meaningful conversations is you understanding the environment you are in. Understand if you have the freedom to have that kind of conversation in the space you are in. There's some conversations whereby probably the people who you are sharing the space or room are not comfortable having that kind of conversation. There are so many examples. Understand, like these days, people are very sensitive. You just don't go anywhere and start having conversations with anyone anyhow. You have to understand the people who are in that room. An example, let's say you call me to a church. I'm not going to go to a church and start talking about Buddha. It will be very different. You can't call me to a church and start talking about Islamic activities. You can't call me to a mosque and I start talking about the Bible and everything. You have to understand the environment you are in so that you know which kind of conversations can I initiate. Let's say if you are in a different place whereby, let's say, as a Christian, you go to a Muslim or a different religion kind of setting. In that point whereby I would advise is to how to have a meaningful conversation there is for you to go and listen, understand why do these people follow this kind of lifestyle? Because when you understand their lifestyle, then you will be able to ask questions that will enable you understand it. You won't just assume. Which leads me to my next point. Having a meaningful conversation, you don't need to assume things. Assumption is it's a very dangerous thing when you are about to have a meaningful conversation. Always have an open mind. Don't assume. For example, because let's say I've had, I'm sure most Africans, or if you go to new places, most people think like people who are not well-traveled, they will ask, do Africans live on trees? People assume probably Africa is all about problems, but there are really some nice places. I'm not saying the society is perfect, but there's the good and the bad. You don't just assume everything about something or anyone is bad. You always have to have that room to let people express themselves. Let them tell you what they really think, so that you don't have to end up assuming things. Because when you start assuming things, that's what you now start breeding conflict. And when you breed conflict, the conversation is over. The world today is in so many conflicts because we assume things. We assume the other person is your enemy. Maybe the person is not even your enemy at all. Like the person is your friend, but because you are assuming, it's causing so many issues, which is not so good. So when you assume, you kill the power of having a meaningful conversation, which can lead to disagreements and conflicts as we see in the world today. So assumption is a very, very dangerous thing while having a meaningful conversation. Another thing about having a meaningful conversation is also understand the age demographics of the people you're having a conversation with. How the millennials have a conversation is different from how the Gen Zs have a conversation. I'll give an example of myself. All my sisters are older than me. So how we have a conversation, or sometimes how they expect me to have a conversation, is a little bit different because we come from different generations. That's how even sometimes when it comes to parenting, how a parent talks to children is different, or sometimes even how parents see life is different. Like children have different kinds of conversation compared to parents. Because as a parent, sometimes they fail to understand children because how they see life is different. So sometimes it can kill having a meaningful conversation because we are all coming from a different generation. But to bridge this gap is very simple. Because we are all coming from a different generation, the key here is very simple: listening. Listening and understanding. Because now you have to understand this person is either younger than me or older than me. This person probably has an experience, more experience than me, or I have a different experience more than the person. This way, you're opening up your brain for more understanding. That's when I come to my next point, is understanding. Having a meaningful conversation is sometimes you have to understand the other person. And when I say understand, I do not mean agree. I mean just understand from which angle they're coming from. You have to understand their background. In some instances, I will even say understand their financial power. For example, growing up in Africa and now living in Canada, the conversations I'll have with someone who is in my village, his needs are very different from my needs right now. Someone in the village is looking like he probably, let's say he is a farmer. How I will have a conversation with him is different from someone I'll have a conversation with here, because his needs are different and my needs are very different. So there's a little bit of clash. But if you understand the angle he's coming from, understand this guy lives here, this is how he sees life, this is how he spends his money, this is how I spend my money. So let's say you're having a conversation on finances. I cannot dictate to him how he's going to spend because he lives in a village. And when I say a village, I do not mean a very rusty, like a hut. No. In Africa, when I say someone is coming from a village, that it just means he's not in the city. But probably he even has a bigger house than you. He has more livestock than you. He lives a totally different lifestyle. So if I give him $100, he will spend it differently from how I am going to spend $100. So when both of us are having, let's say, a financial discussion, it's very different. How he's going to budget his money and how I'm going to budget my money is totally different. That's where now understanding comes in. Understand this guy's environment is different from my environment. And that way, we can both start having meaningful conversations. That's why people in different continents see different, like we see people in Canada see life differently from people who live in Africa. Here is even an interesting thing. In Africa, I didn't even know there was a city called Ottawa in Canada. And even here, how to explain perspective. When you come to Canada, you see Ottawa is way smaller compared to Ontario in terms of buildings, in terms of economic power. When you explain that to an African, he will be like, how come a capital city, which is Ottawa, is less, like its economy is less compared to Toronto? Like the money Toronto makes is way more compared to Ottawa. So someone who's not in Canada or lives somewhere whereby when someone says a capital city, they totally assume. You see now where everything is coming into play. They start assuming because Ottawa is the capital city, people will assume that's where all the money is, that's where all the rich people are. They will assume that's where basically the rich people live. They will assume it's the biggest city in Canada, which is not. Because when you look at other parts of the world, when you say capital city, basically that's the biggest city in that country. But when you come to Canada, just because Ottawa is the biggest city, is the capital city, it doesn't mean it's the biggest city. Someone living now in Africa will be like, how is that even possible? So to have that kind of conversation, the person there or even someone in a different continent will have to understand the demographics of this country. Things are different. Like the capital city here doesn't mean it's the biggest city in the whole country. I'm sure Ottawa is not even the top 3 biggest cities in Canada, but yet it's the capital city. So to have a meaningful conversation on that will be totally different with someone who doesn't understand the political structure and the geographical structure of Canada. And having said that, having meaningful conversations doesn't really mean you just have a meaningful conversations with your peers. Sometimes I tell people like, challenge yourself. Have a meaningful conversation with someone who sees life different than you. Because that's how you learn. Because I'm sure I don't know everything. I'm sure you don't know everything. The only way to expand our knowledge is having a meaningful conversation, is trying to understand the angle which everyone is coming from. Another thing about having a meaningful conversation is sometimes I'll say silence. Silence has power. Just keep quiet and observe. Just silence is key. Sometimes for you to have a meaningful conversation, you need to be quiet, observe, see how things are going. Try to grasp, understand what's going on. Like I said, when you the only way to understand your environment is by you sitting silent and observing what's going on. Observe, I can have a conversation with that person there. I can't have a conversation with that person there. That person there is open to have a conversation with me. The other person is not really open to have a conversation with me. In observation, you start to understand who's friendly, who's more approachable, who's not approachable. Because you also don't want to just approach anyone for the sake of having a meaningful conversation with. You have to understand. And for you to understand, you have to observe. Observe is key. Observation is really key. Because some people are just there just to observe just like you, but not have a conversation. And like I said, the world today needs more meaningful conversations than ever before. Why am I saying this? Because we are seeing conflicts continue day in, day out. And for people who understand politics or political science, the only way to get to diplomacy is having meaningful conversations. When meaningful conversations fail, meaningful diplomacy ends. And when meaningful diplomacy ends, that's now when we see conflicts. So, us understanding a meaningful conversation, we are also contributing to world peace. Because if we can have a meaningful conversation, it's very hard for us to start having conflicts, because you will start to understand where I come from. I will start to understand where you come from. There is a bit of understanding. It doesn't mean we agree. We may disagree, but because we had that kind of meaningful conversation, I'm not throwing a punch. I understand where you are coming from. You understand where I am coming from. So having meaningful conversations is really, really key. I will say it's one of the most important things you need to understand before anything else. It's, I will say, even from birth, like, it's also a challenge to the parents who are watching. Do you have meaningful conversations with kids? Because that one also shapes how a child grows up. Because if you're having a meaningful conversation with children, they will grow up understanding, like, I have to listen to others. I have to give chance to people to express themselves, and I need to listen to them. Because if I do that, I will also be given the chance to express myself, and I will be listened to. So as a parent, if you're not listening to your child or having a meaningful conversation with their children, they will grow up not giving other people a meaningful conversation. As people say, children are the leaders of tomorrow. So if you want the leaders of tomorrow to be great leaders, you have to teach them how to have a meaningful conversation when they are young. Because at the end of the day, having a meaningful conversation is not something that you get in one day. It all takes practice. It's practice, like mathematics. You just have to practice day in, day out. I'll give you an example. When you're going to buy your coffee in the morning, or wherever you buy your food, wherever, try to have a conversation with the person who's selling whatever they're selling to you. Because that way, probably you'll end up having better services. You don't have to look at the person as just an employee behind the counter. Look at the person as your peer. Have a conversation before you get your coffee. Like, hey, how are you? Please, can I have this and this coffee? Yes. How was your day? How's your shift so far? That way, someone is understanding you and you start getting better services. So having a meaningful conversation just doesn't breed good relationships. It also breeds better services. People start serving you better. You start, I will say, you even start to enjoy life because people now understand you. For example, even when you're ordering your coffee, sometimes change it a little bit. Ask the person at the counter, what's your recommendation today? What will you recommend? Because probably they have something better. Having a meaningful conversation gives you insights that you have no clue about. Because like I said, we don't know everything, but from a conversation, that's where we learn. Probably the restaurant you go to, there are discounts for other things. Probably that day you are broke, you have some little money with you. Whatever you buy on the regular, you don't have the money for it. So probably you'll avoid going to buy. But probably when you have a meaningful conversation with the person behind the counter, they will tell you, hey, we have a discount on this and this product. Probably you'll end up saving money. So meaningful conversations also end up saving you money. So I feel having meaningful conversations should be one of the skills we should all have for the betterment of our society and for the betterment of our world. My name is Moses. Thank you for watching Musa Theories. This was having meaningful conversations. Thank you for PodCamp Toronto for making me one of the speakers of the conference. Thank you so much and have a nice day. I'm out.